Good morning, class, and welcome to our final chapter, Chapter 15, where we're going to be discussing juvenile justice in the 21st century. We'll look at things like types of victimization juveniles are experiencing, how mass media has played into delinquency. We'll also look at different career paths in juvenile justice. So let's jump in. Our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you'll be able to describe how juveniles experience victimization, explain what professionalism is and why we need it in this field. Identify why juvenile corrections is a promising career for anyone. To describe the various career options that are available in juvenile corrections, as well as to articulate why an internship in this field makes sense to anyone who's interested in getting into the field as a career. To describe the changing face of juvenile justice and how it's ever changing. And lastly, to be able to describe what juvenile justice will look like in the coming years. So let's start with juvenile victimization. So looking at first the different age groups of victims who experience maltreatment, and then we'll look at the different types of maltreatment that are categorized. So if you look at the chart on the left, you'll see that about 33% of victims of maltreatment are under the age of 3. About 23% are between the ages of 4 and 7, while 18% are between the ages of 8 and 11. So unfortunately, you see here we have a very large number of under 3 years old of children being victimized. And then we have the different types of maltreatment. So you'll see starting from the right here, about 78% are victims of neglect, 17% are victims of physical abuse, 9% are victims of sexual abuse, and 7% are victims of emotional abuse. And if you want to get into the definition of each of those, your book does describe that. So looking now at victimization in the schools. So according to a 2011 report on school crime and school safety that was conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, as well as the National Center on Education Statistics, found that males are more likely to be victims of theft. That males and females are actually victims of violence equally. Students from urban schools are exposed to greater amounts of victimization than those from rural schools. However, suburban schools have the highest number of victimizations. Think about that, not urban schools, suburban schools. And then let's look at bullying. Bullying, we all know, is a huge issue in schools. And I will say that the school system, from my experience, has gotten better since I was in. I graduated in 2010, so I was in middle school, about 4 years before that. And I can share that I was a victim of bullying for a good 2 years by one group of girls. I was not popular. I was a nerd. I really liked school, and they picked on everything and anything they could. When my mom finally went to the school about it to address the principal, because it was turning physical at this point, they were waiting for me after classes, trying to pick fights with me, and I didn't. However, my mother went to the school, and the principal basically told me, well, you won't be in the same classes with these girls next year in high school, because I was in the honor roll track, and they were not. She said, just make it until the end of the year, and you won't have to deal with them anymore. That was the school's response back in, say, 2006, 2007 to bullying. And I will say that as I went through high school, as we got SNAP academies, which were student needs assistance programs, and really developed peer coaching and counseling in the schools, and just making bullying not cool at the end of the day, really I saw a change, and especially my school district where I was. By the end of that, I actually came back to my old high school during my college years to do an internship, and I could see it was much different. There was a much more warm, welcoming experience for all students, and bullying was absolutely not tolerated to any degree. So what are the different types of bullying? Well, you can have direct, which is face-to-face, where there's physical aggression, where one person is hitting, slapping, punching, beating, and causing bodily injury to the other person. You can have verbal. So these are things like teasing, name calling, making fun of one's family, their clothes, their friends. And this affects a victim's way of thinking, affects how they feel, and even the way that they act. And I can say that from personal experience. I know you guys have grown up in the age of media and social media, but it was just upcoming when I was in middle school. So we had AIM. It was just an instant messenger. And I would come home from school to messages. Then after I dealt with all of the girls in school, I would come home to bullying messages online. And it just never stopped. I will say, obviously, now I'm doing fine, but it does still have an effect on you. It really does, long lasting. Then we have emotional and psychological abuse, which is also classified under bullying. So this is where you just want to, where the bully is looking to generate fear, distress, and anxiety. And again, I can share, which I'm sure some of you can also, being bullied does generate fear. It does give you distress and anxiety to not want to go to school. At the end of the day, though, all bullies are simply wishing to exercise power over their victims and to feel superior over them. For what reason? One can say maybe they're experiencing bullying themselves at home, or they're having a poor home life. They're not having things modeled properly for them to be able to act appropriately in school. But if we get into some more impacts of bullying here, it first starts with things like embarrassment, depression, being stressed out, a victim feeling lonely in the school setting, and then it leads to them having a low self-worth, having low confidence in social competence. I can tell you, I still don't feel comfortable in social settings. If I don't know that I'm going to know more than one person at a party, whether it's a family function, friends getting together, I typically will not go, because I still have, and I know it stems from being bullied, this fear in the back of my mind that no one's going to talk to me, no one's going to want to be friends with me, and it gives me anxiety. So I just don't go. So it does have long-lasting impacts. And then, unfortunately, some victims blame themselves for the victimization. They think, well, if I would have done something differently, maybe if I just wouldn't have dressed that way. And did I dress weird in middle school? Absolutely. Would I have probably made fun of myself too, looking back? Yes, absolutely. But when you're developing, when you're a teenager and you're just starting to learn about yourself, it has a huge impact. And unfortunately, it can even lead to things like reputation damage, being publicly humiliated, having a huge damage to the person's self-esteem, even having a negative impact on schoolwork because the juvenile no longer wants to go to school because they're being bullied. And then rejection from their peers, rejection from their social groups. And I didn't put it on here, but one of the last impacts it noted was the impact of potential suicide. And we all know that bullying can lead to that. So we're switching gears a little bit quickly, and we're going to do that throughout this presentation, but it's just the way that this chapter is set up. So we're going to discuss prostitution and how it affects juveniles. So there's an estimated 300,000 to 600,000 child prostitutes in the United States. Now, do not get mad at me for using the word child prostitute. It's the term that they use. I will say that the law is now starting to catch up and starting to realize that a child cannot necessarily be a prostitute because it is a crime to have sex with a child. It is a crime to have sex with a child, so how can a child be considered a prostitute? So they're starting to change the laws here so that we're not charging juveniles for prostitution when we know the causes of prostitution is not because that juvenile simply wanted to be out there doing sexual acts with adults. There are typically reasons. So typically, these, I will say, females mostly, but also males, are picked up from public spaces. They can be smuggled in from other countries, and they're even lured online. Girls typically become involved in prostitution between the ages of 13 and 14 years old. 13 and 14 years old. And it's typically because they're experiencing abuse at home. They're experiencing neglect at home. They don't have what they need. Some are as young as 2 and 3 years old that are being used as prostitutes and being used in the porn industry. And that's sad. It's a very, very sad statistic, but it happens. We even have youth on probation who I know we talked about last chapter, talked about juvenile sex offenders. Some of them have been caught with child victims this young. They've also been caught looking at pornography with child victims this young. They simply use the term prostitutes because it's a person who sells their body for money. So while a child is not they themselves wanting to do it typically to make the money, someone is putting them up to it. So how has mass media played into that, and how has mass media played into delinquency? Well, look at how much violence and even how much sexual scenes are displayed in the media these days. So there's TV violence can actually negatively impact the behavior that children have when children are predisposed to violence. So it's not to say that seeing violence on TV will cause a juvenile to be violent, but if they're predisposed to being violent, then it can just simply exacerbate that and bring that out. Playing violent video games can also make children more aggressive and less prone to helping others. It's just a fact. I know some people will argue that video games don't make people violent, but it just does. We actually talked about this in my community corrections class that I teach at a different university. And we talked about how just simply seeing all of this violence on TV and seeing the news and how gory it can be sometimes and how real and raw has desensitized a lot of us to when we now hear about murders happening, or we hear about rapes and we hear about these heinous crimes, we're not as affected because we're so inundated with it all the time through the media. We then have supremacists and hate groups that will target and recruit young people through the internet. And this last one here, your book talks about how gangster rap has negatively influenced young people because that type of rap specifically talks about devaluing human life as well as family, religious institutions, devaluing school as well as the justice system. However, your book also posed the question of, do these lyrics promote homophobia? The lyrics promote homophobia. They also promote misogyny and racism and materialism. But the question was posed, does this hip hop cause violence, or does it simply reflect the violent ghetto culture? So is this rap trying to promote all of these things, or is it simply talking about things that are actually happening in the world and happening in their world and in their environment? I would challenge you all to think about that. To think about where you've grown up. I know some of you have shared the different experiences you've had with either gangs in your communities, coming from communities that are disorganized and disadvantaged. I didn't have that experience, so for me, I can't relate to that. So I might take a look at this type of rap and say, oh yeah, they're absolutely just promoting this type of behavior. But in reality, maybe they're just explaining what they see on a daily basis. Alright, so now we're going to jump into professionalism and where we have areas for improvement in the field of criminal justice, and then we'll jump into some different careers that you can have. So looking at professionalism says that the person is going to have integrity. That you're going to treat others with dignity and respect. You're going to model positive behavior. That you're committed to a learning model. And by this, I mean that you're always willing to learn. That you never stop wanting to know more and learn more. Because in the field of juvenile justice, it's ever changing. We're always learning, what can we do better? What can we do now to be more effective with youth? You have to believe it's possible to make a difference. I think I shared that when we had our first class together and you all interviewed me for your guest speaker, that the thing that keeps us coming back to work every day is that you believe you can actually make a difference, even in just one child. You have to keep your personal life at home. It's very difficult, but you have to do it. You can't come into the job with a very negative attitude if you had a very rough day. Sometimes it's better just to take the day off, because you need to be your best for these kids, because typically they're not seeing the best from the adults and the role models in their lives. You also need to maintain clean institutions, and this is more for your correctional institutions, your training schools. You need to stress accountability, attention to detail, and following a schedule. You also need to refuse to accept unethical behavior from your coworkers. You have to be willing and able to stand up and say, that's inappropriate, that's not right. We're here for juveniles. We're here to to model positive pro-social behavior, and that's not that. You need to stay positive and also create healthy, and harassment-free workplaces. So in 1970s, American Correctional Association Commission on Accreditation actually established training standards for juvenile justice to help ensure uniformity. I believe it's roughly 120 of pre-service training hours, and then it's 40 hours annually that you'll need as a JPO. Yep, here we go. 120 pre-service hours, forgot I had it there, and then 40 hours annually. So what are some areas that we have for improvement? Well, we could develop a greater clarity of purpose for our correctional organizations. We need to create an accreditation for community-based and institutional facilities. We should set national principles and a philosophy on the acceptance of treatment of facility residents. So how are we going to treat juveniles in a facility, and what is acceptable? We need to discourage training schools turning into juvenile prisons. So they're training schools for a reason. We need to make sure that they're not just simply turning into housing for these youth. We need to be offering them those rehabilitative services, those treatments. Maintaining professionalism when you hire new staff, so ensuring that they have all of those professionalism characteristics. Having a continued use of rehabilitative programs. A residential culture that sanctions abuse and mistreatment of youth. So we need to be not accepting of any type or any form of abuse or mistreatment of youth by staff. And then carefully supervising when restraints are used with youth. And having salaries that are revised periodically. I can tell you, which I think I've told you before, you're not going to make big dollars in this field unless you're a deputy chief or a chief, which it takes a couple years to get to. I can tell you our JPOs start around in my area, typically anywhere from 40 to 60 grand. 60 grand a year is really going to be in your more high class counties. It's around 40 in my county. And then our supervisors in my county start around the upper 50s. In other counties, they might go into the 70s. But you're not going to make $100,000 a year. You do it because you want to help people. And then corrections, you need to have correction and termination by administrative staff for employees who are exhibiting misconduct. Your administration cannot be afraid to fire people if they're not up to standard on their professionalism and if they're not doing their job appropriately. And lastly, private companies also need to maintain standards that county and state corrections do so that we can ensure that great continuum of care, but also ensure that as youth are getting that continuum of care, things don't change from when they're released from a state training school out onto maybe a private aftercare service. So what are some different careers that you can have? You can work in a police department. They typically have juvenile units. You could be a school resource officer, maybe be put on a gang detail, or even give presentations in school settings, such as DARE or the GREAT program that are both showing youth to not use drugs. Most police departments also have a juvenile detective, so it's not saying that you will only stop at being a police officer. You can certainly climb the ladder within a department just working with juveniles. In the court system, you could be a judge, a court referee or a hearing officer, a defense attorney, or even a prosecutor. So let me go back to that quick. Again, most counties will have a juvenile division in their, they'll have a specific juvenile, public defenders. We have a few public defenders that are specific to juvenile, and then in our prosecutor's office, we have a juvenile division as well. And there you're going to make a little more money. So community-based corrections, you could be a probation officer, an aftercare officer or an aftercare worker, a drug court counselor, community correctional treatment specialist, a residential counselor. Typically they'll work in the training schools or in detention centers. You could be director of different court services, director of a residential facility, and even work in a detention center as just a detention worker. They also have supervisors typically in detention centers. So you would start off as a counselor, and then you would work your way up to being a supervisor or a secure detention counselor. So in correctional institutions, you could be a social worker, you could be a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist. We use these all the time in our juvenile court and when our youth are in facilities. A forensic psychopathologist. You could be a recreational therapist, which is just your regular therapist that's going to treat youth on a daily basis inside the facilities. A youth counselor, similar to the detention counselors, or even custodial staff. You could be a custodial supervisor. You could be an assistant superintendent, a superintendent, which is simply like a director of the correctional facility. You could be a high school teacher, because remember, youth by law have to get an education. So you could be a teacher. So go to school for teaching, and you can work in a detention facility or in a juvenile correctional facility. A vocational teacher. Almost all of our programs have some type of vocation, whether it's woodworking, barbering, like beauty, I want to say beauty parlor type for females if they wish to do that. Typically males do the barbering. There's so many things. Nursing, some of them even have. Horticulture, some programs have. So you can find many different areas of something that you enjoy doing and then translating that into the juvenile system. Even a high school principal, because some of our facilities, I think I explained this one of our last classes, some of our facilities actually have a full school district in their facility because their campus is so large. So they're going to need a principal for that school. And finally, you could be a chaplain. Looking at internships, why are they important? So you're going to receive supervised, practical, on-the-job training in the specific area that you're interested in. Typically, they can be either paid or you'll receive college credit. Not often will you receive both, but it has happened. You also have the possibility of being hired upon graduation. It also offers great resources for you. I will push internships all day long because internships are the best way to make connections to get jobs. So there's two links here that your book talks about, the Internship Bible and Peterson's Internships, which are just resources for you to look at, as well as the American Correctional Association's website to get ideas on different internships that you could engage in. Many will require a background check, so keep that in mind. And it's important to start your search early so that you don't wait until the end and have them already have their internships full. Typically, they'll start the process early because they do require a background check. And lastly, network, network, network. I cannot say it enough. Make connections, ask for phone numbers and emails, ask if you can use them as a reference. Just do it. It's how I got my job. It's how I got almost all of my jobs. Know somebody, make the connection, and they will help get you to where you need to be. So let's briefly just talk about techno-corrections in juvenile justice. So we've had an increased use of technology to monitor both probation, aftercare, and institutional populations. We've had increased security with the use of like electric fences. But this could be reducing human interaction that youth are having with people. So because of this reduced human interaction, there is the concern that there's going to have an adverse impact on prisoners when they're re-entering society. So prisoners, you can also translate that into juveniles when they're re-entering. If you place a youth in too confined of an institution, sometimes it's necessary based on their crimes. But similar to when an adult comes out of prison then, if they're in a secure lockdown facility with barbed wire, how are they learning to interact with other humans when everything is technology based and technology is keeping them confined? So what does the future of juvenile justice look like? Well, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that the juvenile population, so those under the age of 18, is going to increase 36% between 2000 and 2050. They say that many of these youth are going to come from impoverished homes that are headed by single mothers, and we see that now, so that's no surprise. They say that violence, though, and homicide rates may grow again, but let's take this with a grain of salt because they also said that juvenile super predators were going to emerge in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and that didn't happen. Although, on the other hand, I will say we've been seeing youth, and like our guest speaker talked about last class, more youth with guns, a lot more youth on youth violence, and we have seen a large homicide rate. not among youth necessarily, but among youth committing homicides. That adolescent psychiatry is going to be utilized even more to treat youth, because we're realizing that they're experiencing childhood problems, they're experiencing childhood traumas, and that's what's leading them or contributing to their delinquency. So we need to address the root causes of why they're acting out before we can actually address the acting out. That gangs, drugs, and guns are always going to be a social problem, and we see that. There's going to be continued efforts to create uniformity and to reduce discretion in juvenile sentencing, which we have some standards now, but we could use national standards. That continued deinstitutionalized movement, we don't want to institutionalize youth, and we have cut our numbers down drastically. We used to have roughly over 50 youth in placement. I would have almost half of my caseload just in placement alone, and I had 30 cases. Now we maybe have between 15 and 20 youth department-wide that are placed, and that's only for those youth who absolutely need it. We're going to have an increased use of drug courts, teen courts, and gun courts to divert youth away from the juvenile system, and using more restorative justice practices as well as private programs to treat youth. We're going to have an increased mechanism to transfer youth to the adult court, which is unfortunate. But yes, at the same time, we do need it for certain types of crimes that are committed. Although this doesn't really quite fit in with the idea that we should deinstitutionalize youth, that we should use more rehabilitative services or practices. Does it? It doesn't really fit in with diversion. So let's hope that this doesn't happen, that we don't end up having more increased mechanisms to transfer youth to the adult court. And lastly, disproportionate minority confinement will remain a problem, as it is today. So, in sum, this was longer than I anticipated, so I apologize. But in sum, the family, socioeconomic structure, neighborhood, school, and media all influence lawful as well as unlawful behavior. Juveniles are more likely to be victimized than any other group. Professionalism means that you're going to maintain integrity, treat youth with dignity and respect, as well as their parents, and that you believe that a difference can be made in their lives. Juvenile justice careers, typically, after advancement, offer a advancement, good salary, benefits packages, and even pensions. Career fields can include things such as police, community-based, correctional institutions, as well as the court system. Correctional internships will provide you hands-on experience, networking, and the potential for job opportunities upon graduation. The juvenile justice is increasingly utilizing technology, restorative justice practices, evidence-based practices, and we're emphasizing re-entry and the continuum of care. And finally, the future of juvenile justice is going to see an increased juvenile population and many of the same issues that plague the field today. So that is your Chapter 15 lecture. I hope you all have a great week.